Nell had never known how to say no. Not to the glass of liquor Tate pressed into her hand after a late shift. Not to her brother calling at 3 o'clock in the morning to ask for money for the 10th time. Not to the cafe owner who made her do the work of 3 people because the other 2 hadn't shown up, and nobody had bothered to say a word. And certainly not when 2 men built like refrigerators shoved her into a black SUV in a Brooklyn alley and told her that her brother owed $2 million, and now that debt belonged to her. So when Nell was taken to a penthouse high above Manhattan, worn to the bone, a little drunk, and pointed toward the second door on the left so she could wash her face, she counted wrong. She went through the first door. Inside was the most luxurious room she had ever seen in her life, and there was a jacuzzi tub breathing up clouds of steam, the water clear as glass, the light low and soft, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Nell looked at the tub. Her whole life had been a rusted showerhead dripping in a damp studio apartment. She thought, or rather, she stopped thinking altogether. She slipped out of her uniform, stepped in, and sank beneath the heat. Then a man opened the door, not an ordinary man. His shoulders nearly touched both sides of the frame. His face looked as though it had been carved from stone, and his dark eyes fixed on her with a kind of absolute shock. He was Cade Mercer, the most powerful mafia boss in New York. The man the whole city feared so much that people didn't dare say his name after 10 at night. And she was naked in his bathtub. Cade looked at her. Nell blinked back at him. She should have been afraid. She should have screamed, apologized, climbed out of the tub, and run for her life. But the alcohol had destroyed every filter left in her mind, and the most frightening mafia boss in New York was standing there looking completely bewildered because of her, and Nell found that so funny she couldn't bear it. So she laughed. And then she said, in a voice as serious as if she were introducing the special of the day, "The water's wonderful. You should try it. If this story made you curious, hit like so, I'll know you want to hear more. Share it with someone who could use a good story tonight. And subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next part. Because trust me, this is only the beginning." Cade Mercer stood there, standing as if someone had pressed pause on his entire body. 20 years in the underworld, 13 years running the Mercer Empire, and he had seen enough to exhaust the imagination. Traitors kneeling at his feet, begging for mercy. Enemies trembling when they heard his name. The most powerful politicians in New York calling him sir without needing to be reminded. But never, not once in his life, had anyone been lying naked in his bathtub, drunk, inviting him to get in with her. He didn't know how to react, and the very fact that he didn't know how to react was itself something that had never happened before. Just 2 hours earlier, he had been sitting alone in his private restaurant on the 42nd floor, candles flickering, fresh flowers on the table, a place set for 2. Celeste Marchetti, his fiancée, Don Marchetti's daughter, the woman he was going to marry in order to unite 2 empires and cut off the growing Volkov family from the east, hadn't come, the 3rd time in 2 weeks. Her assistant had sent a message in the tone of someone who had drafted it in advance. "Miss Marchetti isn't feeling well. She sends her apologies." Cade had remained seated for another 15 minutes after reading that message, not because he hoped she would come, but because he didn't want to stand up in front of the waitstaff who were trying not to look at him with pity. He had looked at his own reflection in the dark glass, Manhattan flickering behind him, and seen exactly what everyone else saw. A man who looked like a weapon. Broad shoulders, a hard jaw, eyes that were never warm. Of course she hadn't come. Nobody wanted to have dinner with a loaded gun. He had returned to the penthouse in the mood of a man who had just confirmed something he had known for a very long time. Then he opened the bathroom door and saw the girl. The debtor's sister. The girl who folded paper cranes in the interrogation room, and she was laughing. Laughing in his face. Not the kind of laugh that begged. Not the kind that trembled with fear. Not the kind that tried to flatter. A real laugh. The kind that burst up from the belly. The kind that came when something was so absurd a person couldn't help it. And clearly she found him. Cade Mercer, the mafia boss of New York, standing paralyzed by the sheer absurdity in front of his own bathtub, to be the most absurd thing that had happened all night. No one laughed when they were alone with him. No one looked at him without calculation, fear, or both. This girl did neither. She only laughed, and the sound of it did something strange to his chest that he decided not to examine just then. Cade took a bathrobe from the hook and turned his face away. "Put this on," he said, his voice dry and monotone, like a recorded message, as though this were a situation he handled every day. He heard the water stir, heard fabric being pulled into place, then a tiny little O. He turned back. She was standing there, his robe wrapped around her body like a blanket. She was so small that the hem dragged across the floor, the sleeves hanging past her hands by more than a span. She looked like a child dressed in an adult's clothing, and she was breathing in the fabric, eyes closed, her face full of pure contentment. "What cologne do you wear?" she asked, her voice as serious as if she were asking for classified national intelligence. Cade opened his mouth and then closed it again. He didn't wear cologne. It was the scent of soap and linen and perhaps whiskey. But he wasn't going to explain that to a drunk girl standing in his bathroom at midnight. Then she shivered, not with fear, but from cold. Wet hair, chilled skin, a robe that hadn't had time yet to hold any warmth. She shivered without even realizing she was shivering, still busy inhaling the scent of his robe. Cade set his hand on her shoulder, only to steady her. Only because she was swaying and he didn't want her to fall and crack her head on the marble floor and force him to explain to someone why there was a dead girl in his bathroom. That was all. 2 seconds. His hand on her shoulder, her bones small beneath his palm. Then he pulled his hand away. But in those 2 seconds, she lifted her face and looked up at him. And Cade saw something in her eyes he wasn't prepared to see. Not fear, not calculation, but wonder. The kind of wonder that belonged to someone who wasn't used to being touched by anyone who didn't want something from her. 2 seconds of his hand on her shoulder, and she looked at him as if that were the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her in her life. Cade withdrew his hand, stepped back. "Oren," he called, his voice composed and professional, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Oren appeared at the door within 3 seconds, looked at the girl in his boss's bathrobe, looked at his boss, and wisely decided not to ask a single question. "Take her back to her room," Cade said. "Make sure she doesn't fall down the stairs." Oren nodded and led the girl away. She followed obediently, still wrapped in his robe, and at the doorway she turned back to look at him one more time. "Thanks for the robe," she said, her words already beginning to slur with sleep. "And the bathtub. The bathtub is amazing. You really should try it." Then she disappeared beyond the door. Cade stood alone in the bathroom. The steam had faded. The water lay still. But the scent hadn't gone anywhere. Cheap vanilla. The kind that came in shampoo bought at a corner store, mixed with bar whiskey and something warmer, softer. Perhaps only the scent of her skin after soaking in hot water. The fragrance clung to the surface of the water, to the robe he would now have to wash, to the air he was breathing. Cade stood there longer than was reasonable for a man standing in his own bathroom, breathing in the scent of his own tub. Then he thought, very clearly, very calmly, this is a problem. Nell woke at 7 in the morning and gave herself exactly 4 seconds to enjoy the feeling of lying in the softest bed of her life, before the memory of last night came crashing down over her like ice water. The bathtub, the mafia boss, her naked. "The water's wonderful. You should try it." Nell pulled the blanket over her head and made a sound that, if anyone had heard it, would have made them call an ambulance. She stayed there another 10 minutes, trying to convince herself it had only been a dream, but the scent of his robe still lingered on her skin, and that robe was folded neatly over the back of the chair, because she had folded it before going to sleep, because she was the kind of person who folded other people's things even while wanting to die of embarrassment. She sat up. The room was small, clean, simple. A bed, a dresser, a small table beside a window overlooking the Manhattan skyline she would never be able to afford, not even from a distance. The door was locked from the outside. Not a prison, but not freedom either. She was trapped inside the penthouse of New York's mafia boss because her brother owed $2 million and had vanished, and last night she had bathed in his tub and invited him to join her. Nell looked at her reflection in the glass. Tangled hair, dark circles under her eyes, still wearing the black uniform from the night before. She looked exactly like what she was, a night shift bartender having the worst day of her life. A knock at the door. Oren, Cade's bodyguard, stood outside with the kind of expressionless face Nell was beginning to suspect was the only expression he had. "Mr. Mercer wants to see you. 15 minutes. He handed her a set of clean clothes, simple ones, a white shirt, black trousers. Nell changed, tried to do something with her hair, then gave up. She followed Oren down a long hallway, into an elevator, down one floor, and into a meeting room that looked as though it had been designed specifically to make whoever sat across from the table feel very, very small. A long glass table, black leather chairs, glass walls overlooking the city, and Cade Mercer sat at the head of the table reading documents, looking as though he had never seen her naked in his bathtub 10 hours earlier. He wore a gray suit, his sleeves neatly rolled, and he looked impeccably poised, entirely in control, completely unlike the man who had stood frozen in that bathroom the night before. Nell hated that. She was ready to sink into the earth, and he was sitting there as if he were chairing a board meeting. "Sit," Cade said without looking up. Nell sat, as far away as possible, at the very end of the table, pulling the chair out another half-meter just to be safe. Cade turned a page. Brody Ashford, 32 years old. Owes my organization $2 million from a poker table in Atlantic City. Signed an acknowledgement of debt. Disappeared 3 weeks ago. He looked up at her. "You know where he is?" It wasn't a question. Nell swallowed. "No, I really don't. The last time you spoke to him? 3 weeks ago. He called asking for money. I gave him all my savings. $5,000, 2 years of saving." She paused. Then he turned off his phone and never called again. Cade looked at her. Nell looked back, and she decided that if she had already stood naked in front of this man the night before, then she could be naked in the truth too. "I make $400 a week," she said. $500 on weeks when the tips are good. I pay $1,200 a month for a studio in Brooklyn. I eat instant noodles 4 days a week. I don't have health insurance. I don't have a car, and I don't have a savings account anymore because I just gave everything to my brother. She tilted her head. "You want me to pay back $2 million. Do you take installment plans? Because if I'm doing the math right, and math isn't exactly my best subject, I'll finish paying you back sometime around the year I turn 97. I'll write you a check from the nursing home." She laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd that crying or laughing hardly made a difference. And laughing, at least, didn't make mascara run, even though she wasn't wearing mascara, even though she didn't own mascara. Cade didn't laugh, but Nell saw it, very quickly. So quickly she almost thought she had imagined it, the corner of his mouth twitching once. Only once, then his face went flat again. "I have a proposal," he said. "There's an important event at the penthouse this weekend. I need extra staff. You're a bartender. You know the work. And if I do it, then we begin the count. You work, I reduce the debt. Not installment payments until you're 97. Nell looked at him. She wasn't stupid. She knew $2 million couldn't be repaid by pouring cocktails, no matter how good she was at it. But she also knew she had no other choice except the one being offered to her. "Okay," she said. The word left her mouth as easily as breathing. It always did. Saying yes had always been easier than saying no. Then, before she could stop herself, her voice dropped. "My brother," she said. "Brody, your people are looking for him, right?" Cade looked at her. Nell swallowed hard. "Is he hurt? Have you? Is he okay?" And for the first time since she had been shoved into that black SUV in the Brooklyn alley, Nell trembled. Not trembling from cold or from fear for herself. Trembling for Brody. Because her brother was an idiot, a gambler, the man who had dragged her down into the mud, but he was also the only person in this world who shared her blood, the only one who remembered their mother's face, the only one who knew she had been afraid of thunderstorms since childhood. And if he was hurt, if they had done something to him, Nell didn't know how she would go on living. Cade was silent for a moment. Then he said, his voice no softer, but not as hard as before, "We haven't found him yet." A pause. "If we do, I'll let you know." Nell nodded, stood up. "Thank you," she said, and she wanted to say something more, but her throat had already closed. She turned and walked away. At the door, she stopped for just a second, her hand brushing the small table beside it where a box of tissues sat. Her fingers folded, turned, bent, a habit from childhood. Every time she was anxious, she folded paper, whatever was in her hand, into a shape. She set the tiny paper crane down on the table without thinking, then walked out. The meeting room was empty. Cade remained seated there for another minute. Then he stood, crossed to the small table by the door, and looked down. The paper crane rested on the wood, white, tiny, folded from thin tissue paper but astonishingly perfect, every crease sharp and precise, both wings opened evenly. She had folded it while trying not to cry, and it was still perfect. Cade picked up the crane, turned it lightly in his hand. It weighed almost nothing, fragile enough that he could have crushed it with one finger. He went back to his desk, opened the top drawer. Inside, it was completely empty. The wooden surface polished clean, not a single photograph, not a single personal object, nothing at all. 13 years at this desk, and the drawer had never held anything except papers. Cade placed the paper crane inside, closed the drawer. The first object. 3 days after the meeting in the conference room, Nell stood in the penthouse kitchen wearing a black uniform, her hair pinned up neatly, a tray of cocktails in her hands, trying not to throw up from nerves. Cade Mercer's engagement party to Celeste Marchetti was being held on the penthouse rooftop, and it was larger than anything Nell had ever served in her life. The bar where she worked in Brooklyn had 20 tables, half of them wobbling, and the fanciest regular was a divorce lawyer who drank gin and tonics and cried around midnight. Here, everything gleamed so brightly that Nell was afraid to touch it. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, fresh flowers arranged in vases she guessed cost as much as 3 months of her rent. The guests were all faces she had seen in newspapers or on the evening news. Politicians, businessmen, and people Nell guessed belonged to Cade's world, only dressed in better suits. Nell carried her cocktail tray through the crowd, trying to make herself invisible. She was good at that. She had spent her whole life practicing how to become invisible, moving through a room without anyone remembering her face, serving without anyone really seeing her. It was a survival skill for someone raised in foster care, where the less people noticed her, the less trouble found her. But tonight, as she slipped through the crowd, her eyes kept searching for one person. Cade stood by the great window overlooking Manhattan, in a black suit and black shirt, no tie. He looked like a piece of night someone had cut out and set in the middle of a room blazing with light. Beautiful enough to be dangerous, or dangerous enough to be beautiful. Nell wasn't sure which came first. A glass of whiskey rested in his hand, and his gaze moved over the room with the calm detachment of a man controlling everything without needing to take part in any of it. And then Nell saw it. The thing she guessed no one else in that room saw, or no one wanted to see. Cade was standing in a room full of people, but no one was standing near him. There was an invisible circle around him, a radius of about 2 meters, and no one stepped inside it for more than 30 seconds. People approached, said a few words, gave a strained laugh, then withdrew. One man clapped him on the shoulder, then snatched his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. A woman touched her glass to his, then turned away at once, relief slipping out with her breath the moment she was far enough away. Everyone in that room was at a party. Cade was standing alone in the middle of a crowd. Loneliness had a visible shape, and tonight it looked like Cade Mercer holding a whiskey glass by the window, a whiskey no one dared approach to refill, because that would require standing beside him for longer than 30 seconds. Nell looked at him and felt something sharp catch in her chest, something she had no right to feel. She knew what it was to stand in a room full of people and belong to no one. She had stood that way for 13 years in foster care, through every Christmas party thrown by foster families where she knew she was only ever a temporary guest. She recognized his loneliness because it looked exactly like hers, except his was wrapped in a $10,000 suit, and hers had always been wrapped in a bar apron. Then she saw Celeste. Cade's fiancée stood on the other side of the room, and if Cade was darkness, Celeste was a blade, beautiful in a razor-sharp way, glossy black hair, a fitted red dress, and a perfect smile that Nell recognized at once as practiced. Celeste spoke to guests, laughed at the right moments, touched the right arms, but not once in the past 2 hours had Nell seen her step inside the invisible circle around Cade, his fiancé, and she didn't go near him. Nell noticed that and stored it away before she understood what it meant. She turned back to work, carrying the tray toward a cluster of guests near the window, and her foot caught on the leg of a chair. The tray tipped. 4 cocktails slid forward. Nell saw her brief serving career flash before her eyes. Then a hand caught the tray, so fast she hadn't seen him move. Cade was standing right beside her, one hand steadying the tray, the other touching her wrist lightly to keep her balanced. The cocktails remained upright. Not one drop spilled. His hand touched hers. His skin was warm, his hand twice the size of hers, and Nell forgot to breathe for one beat. He leaned down, close enough that she could smell him, linen and whiskey, and something beneath that she remembered from the night in the bathroom. "Are you all right?" he asked, quietly, for her ears alone. 3 words. "Are you all right?" Nell blinked up at him, and something in her chest cracked open. Only a little. Like a fracturing glass too fine to see until the whole thing shatters. No one asked her that. No one asked whether she was all right. Her boss asked whether she could come in. Tate asked whether she could switch shifts. Brody asked whether she had money. Everyone asked what she could do for them. No one asked if she was all right. Ever. "I'm all right," she said, and her voice sounded steady, betraying none of the chaos inside. "Thank you." Cade let go, stepped back. The invisible circle closed around him again, and once more he was Cade Mercer, mafia boss, wall, weapon. But Nell had been inside that circle for 30 seconds, and she had seen what was there. She carried the tray away, her heart beating faster than was reasonable for someone who had nearly spilled a few cocktails. She didn't turn back to look, but if she had, she would have seen Cade still standing there, watching her, the whiskey forgotten before it ever reached his mouth. And from the corner of the room, half hidden behind a marble column, Celeste Marchetti was watching the entire exchange through cold, sharp eyes and a smile that, if Nell had seen it, would have kept her awake all night. Nell was folding the leftover napkins from the party the night before, alone in the small service room beside the penthouse kitchen, when the door opened and Celeste Marchetti stepped inside. Nell had never stood this close to Celeste before. On the stage of the engagement party, Celeste had been a painting, perfect from a distance, but at a range of 1 meter, under the fluorescent lights of the service room, she was something else. Black eyes, sharp, looking at Nell as if she were reading a financial report and had already found the error in it. Thin lips, unsmiling, a back held straight in the way of someone who had never been permitted to slouch. Celeste closed the door behind her, and Nell understood at once that this wasn't a casual visit. "Nell Ashford," Celeste said, her voice brittle and level, hiding her true intent. 27 years old, bartender at O'Malley's in Brooklyn, orphaned at 14. Brother, Brody Ashford, owes the Mercer family $2 million in gambling debt and disappeared. You were taken 4 days ago to stand in for that debt. She paused. Did I miss anything? Nell set the napkin down. Her hands felt slightly cold. How do you know all that? I'm Don Marchetti's daughter, Celeste said, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. I also know, Celeste continued, taking one more step into the room, that last night Cade caught your tray when you nearly tripped, that he stood beside you for 30 seconds, longer than the time he spent with any guest at his own engagement party, and that he asked whether you were all right. Celeste tilted her head slightly. He has never asked me that. Not once. Not in 6 months of being engaged. Silence. Nell didn't know what to say. She didn't know where this conversation was going, but she knew it wasn't going anywhere good. I'll be direct, Celeste said, and she pulled out a chair and sat across from Nell with the grace of someone who could make any chair look like a throne. I don't want to marry Cade Mercer. Nell blinked. That wasn't what she had expected. This marriage is my father's idea, Celeste continued, her voice steady. Unite Mercer and Marchetti, block Volkov, control the entire eastern side of the city. A perfect strategy on paper. But I'm not a chess piece on my father's board. She paused, and for the first time, Nell saw something real behind the glass. There's someone, Celeste said, more quietly. Her name is Raina. She doesn't belong to this world, and I can't have her if I marry Cade. Nell looked at Celeste and saw, beneath all that razor-sharp coldness, a woman trapped just as she was. Different cages, same kind of lock. I'm building an alliance of my own, Celeste said, her voice sharpening again. When it's strong enough, I'll replace my father and take control of the Marchetti family. But I need time, and I need Cade focused somewhere else. Celeste's eyes locked on Nell. That's where you come in. Nell's heartbeat slowed, or sped up. She couldn't tell which. What do you want from me? Nell asked. You're close to him, Celeste said. You don't need to pretend to be anyone. You don't need to perform a role. You only need to be yourself. The bartender girl he can't stop looking at. You stay near him, he gets distracted, he cares less about the engagement, and I get time. And in return, I erase Brody's $2 million debt, completely, and I help you find your brother. My network is wider than you think. $2 million. Gone. Brody found. Freedom. For one instant, Nell saw it flash before her eyes. A life without debt pressing on her chest, without black SUVs in dark alleys, without lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering whether her brother was still alive. Then another image pushed its way in. Cade standing by the window, the invisible circle around him always empty, his hand catching the tray for her, warm and steady. his voice by her ear, low and quiet, asking, "Are you all right?" His hand on her shoulder that night in the bathroom. 2 seconds. Only 2 seconds. But she had looked at him and seen the thing he didn't want anyone to see, and he had placed her paper crane inside an empty drawer. Nell was being offered money for his kindness. More precisely, she was being asked to stay near him so he would look at her instead of looking at Celeste. And she knew exactly what that meant. It meant using the way he looked at her, using those 2 seconds of his hand on her shoulder, using the 3 words, "Are you all right?" Words he had never said to anyone else. And Nell hated it. She hated it with everything inside her. But she also remembered Brody's voice on the phone at 3 in the morning, trembling. "Nell, I need help." She remembered the damp studio apartment, the leaking shower head, 4 meals of instant noodles every week. She remembered those 2 towering human walls shoving her into the SUV, and the cold look in their eyes when they said, "The debt is yours now. $2 million. Brody. No way out. It was always like this. Nell always said yes because she had never had enough to lose for no to be an option. "Okay," Nell said. The word left her mouth and she hated herself instantly. Hated herself all the way down to the bone. The kind of hatred she knew would follow her into sleep tonight and into many nights after. Celeste rose to her feet, smoothly, quickly, like someone who had just signed a contract. At the door, she paused and turned back to look at Nell with black eyes that couldn't be read. "I don't need you to love him," Celeste said. "I only need him to look at you long enough to forget to look at me." The door closed. Nell sat alone in the service room, surrounded by half-folded napkins, and thought that the last thing Celeste had said wouldn't be the problem. Then panic hit her, because what had she just thought? 2 days after the agreement with Celeste, Nell sat in the black SUV beside Cade Mercer and tried to remember why she was here, to distract him, to make him look at her. That was the assignment. But Cade was reading documents on his phone, completely silent, and Nell was busy watching the way his hand moved as he turned each page. Large hands, long fingers, a pale scar across one knuckle. And she found herself wondering when he had gotten that scar, before realizing that wasn't information she needed to know. The car stopped in front of a building in Tribeca. Black glass facade. No sign up yet. The inside still being finished. Oren opened the car door. Nell stepped out, and Cade spoke his first words in 20 minutes. "I just bought this place. A lounge bar. You're a bartender. I need your professional opinion." Nell stepped inside and forgot Celeste. Forgot the agreement. Forgot the $2 million and Brody and the debt pressing down on her life. Because she was standing on home ground. A long oak bar, brass lighting, 3 backlit shelves of liquor glowing behind it. She walked up to the counter, her hand gliding across the wood, and everything inside her changed. Her back went straighter. Her eyes grew sharper. Her hands found their place on the bar top, as if they had found home. She picked up the cocktail menu waiting on the counter, read it for 10 seconds, and frowned. "Who wrote this menu?" she asked, and her voice no longer sounded like the voice of the trembling girl in the interrogation room or the bowed head server at the party. Her voice was sharp, clear, confident. The voice of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Cade stood 3 steps away, one hand in his pocket, and watched. A Negroni made with this kind of gin would be better off calling itself rubbing alcohol, Nell said, turning the page. An espresso martini that doesn't specify the coffee source means customers are going to get something that tastes like dishwater. And an old-fashioned, she stopped, looked up, and genuine pain crossed her face. An old-fashioned made with the cheapest bourbon on the bottom shelf might as well just say, "We don't respect our guests," and save the ink. Cade looked at her. And Nell, for the first time since stepping into his world, saw him looking at her not with control or judgment or caution. He looked at her with something close to surprise. "Make me one," he said. Nell moved behind the bar as though entering a kingdom. Her hand found the bottle of bourbon on the shelf, the best one available, and she began. She didn't look at him while she mixed the drink. She didn't need to look at anyone when she mixed. The sugar cube dissolved into the whiskey. The bitters landed in exactly 2 drops. The orange peel twisted lightly across the surface, a faint mist of orange oil rising into the air. She set the glass in front of Cade. He took a sip, held it in his mouth for 1 second, set the glass down. "That is the best old-fashioned I've ever had," he said. His voice was flat as always, but his eyes weren't. Nell blushed. She blushed and hated herself for it, because she wasn't used to being praised. At the bar in Brooklyn, customers praised her by not complaining. Her boss praised her by not yelling. No one had ever told Nell that anything she made was the best they had ever had. "Where did you learn to mix drinks?" Cade asked, sitting down on a bar stool. And that was when they began to talk. Really talk. Not the conference room kind of questioning. Not the 3-second politeness of the engagement party. Nell told him about the bar, about the first time she had stood behind a counter at 19, about an old bartender named Mickey, who taught her everything, and then died of lung cancer 2 years later, about the way she could watch a customer walk through the door and guess what they wanted to drink before they even sat down. She said more than she had intended to say. She always did that, gave away more than she meant to. But this time it wasn't because anyone had forced her. It was because Cade listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't glance at his phone. He didn't look impatient. He sat there with the old-fashioned in front of him and listened to her talk about bourbon and bitters, as if she were explaining the secrets of the universe. "Do you always carry other people's burdens?" he asked. And the question came so unexpectedly that Nell stopped in the middle of a sentence about proportions. "Why do you ask that?" "Because I saw you clearing tables for 3 people at the party while they stood around talking. Because you handed over your entire savings to your brother without thinking twice. Because you sat in my interrogation room worrying about Brody before you worried about yourself." Nell went quiet. Then she said, softly, honestly in a way she hadn't planned, "I do know how to say no. I just don't want to see people's faces when they hear it. That look of disappointment. That look that says, 'I thought you'd help.' I can't stand that look. So I say yes. Always. It's easier." She looked down at the bar. "Even when it swallows me whole." Cade was silent for a moment. Nell thought he was going to say something about weakness, about how she needed to be tougher, the kind of advice people always gave her. But Cade didn't say that. Instead, he said, very quietly, as though the words weren't meant for her ears and had only happened to fall into the room, "I'm the opposite. Everyone can say yes to me, but nobody wants to." Nell looked up. Cade wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the old-fashioned, turning it slowly against the polished bar, and his face didn't change. Still cold, still controlled. But that sentence, those 8 words, had just opened a door. Nell guessed he opened for no one. Everyone said yes to him because they were afraid to say no, and nobody wanted to say yes because they were afraid to speak the truth. He sat at the top of an empire, surrounded by people willing to agree, and not one of them did it because they wanted to. Nell looked at him and felt something shift inside her chest, slow and heavy as a stone beginning to roll, and she knew she would remember those 8 words for a long time. Longer than she should, longer than her agreement with Celeste allowed her to remember them. On the way back, in the penthouse elevator, Oren looked at Cade with the eyes of a man who had spent 15 years reading his boss. "Is she going to keep working at the lounge?" Oren asked, his tone neutral. "Keep her on the service crew," Cade said. "Because she makes a good cocktail?" Oren asked. Cade didn't answer. The elevator doors opened. He stepped out, and Oren remained behind, watching his boss's back. And for the first time in 15 years, he saw Cade Mercer unable to answer a simple question. Celeste called at 11 o'clock that night. Her voice was flat and precise, like a surgical blade. "I need Cade's schedule for next week. Who he's meeting, when, where. His study is on the 31st floor. The door isn't locked at night because he trusts his security system. The documents are usually on the desk. Take pictures and send them to me." Nell sat on the bed in her small room at the penthouse, the phone pressed to her ear, staring at the white wall across from her. "Tonight?" she asked. "Tonight. Cade has a habit of soaking in the tub at midnight, then reading until 1 in the morning. From 11:30 to 12:30, the study is empty." "How do you know his routine that well?" "Because I'm his fiancé and I'm not stupid, Nell." Celeste hung up. Nell sat there another 10 minutes, looking at the dark screen of her phone, then stood up. The hallway on the 31st floor at 11:30 at night was as empty as a graveyard. The lights were dimmed low, a soft golden glow, and the thick carpet swallowed every sound of her steps. Nell was barefoot because her shoes would have clicked against the wood floor at the end of the hallway where the carpet stopped, and she had thought through that detail carefully enough to realize she was planning to steal documents from a mafia boss with a level of professionalism that was deeply alarming for a bartender. The study door wasn't locked, just as Celeste had said. Nell pushed it open gently, slipped inside, and shut it behind her. The room was dark, lit only by city light spilling through the great windows. Enough for her to make out the desk, the leather chair, the bookshelves covering the walls. On the desk, beside a sleeping laptop, was an open stack of documents. Nell stepped forward. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know whether they were shaking from fear of getting caught or from disgust with herself. Probably both. Probably those were the same thing. She took out her phone, opened the camera, turned off the flash, and began taking pictures. First page. Next week's schedule. Meetings, places, names. Second page. Cade's handwritten notes, surprisingly neat and clear for a man with hands that large. Third page. She had just finished photographing the third page when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart stopped. Not stopped in the figurative sense. She actually felt her chest go empty for one beat, as if her heart had heard it before her brain had, and decided to go on strike. The footsteps were heavy, even, slow. Cade. She recognized the rhythm of his walk, and the fact that she recognized the rhythm of his walk was information she would deal with later, when she wasn't standing inside his study at midnight, with her phone full of stolen documents. The footsteps came closer to the door. Nell stopped breathing, stood perfectly still. Her phone pressed hard against her chest, as if she could hide it inside her ribs. The footsteps stopped in front of the door. 1 second, 2 seconds. Nell thought about what she would say if he opened it. "I got lost, wouldn't work on the 31st floor. I was sleepwalking, was pathetic. I'm stealing your documents for your fiancée because she promised to erase my brother's debt, was honest." But it would probably be the last sentence she ever spoke before disappearing from the face of the earth. 3 seconds. Then the footsteps moved on, farther away. Gone. Nell let out her breath, slow and shaking, and looked down at her hands. They were trembling so badly she couldn't have taken another picture even if she had wanted to. She shoved the phone into her pocket, turned to leave, and then her eyes stopped. On Cade's desk, beside the laptop, beside the stack of documents she had just stolen photographs of, was the paper crane. The crane she had folded from a tissue in the conference room days earlier. Small, white, fragile. He hadn't thrown it away, hadn't brushed it into the trash. He had placed it on his desk, beside the laptop, where he would see it every day. Nell stood there in the dark study looking at the paper crane, and betrayal stopped being an abstract word. It became physical, sharp as a blade, something driven straight through the center of her chest. She was stealing documents from a man who kept her paper crane on his desk. She left the study like the thief she was, because that was exactly what she was. Sent the pictures to Celeste, lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and didn't sleep. 2 days later, Nell heard the news from Oren. Cade had discovered a traitor inside the organization, a lieutenant secretly in contact with the Volkov family, exposed because the schedule for a secret meeting had surfaced in documents. Cade reviewed again after finding what he called a security breach. The traitor had been dealt with. Cade was safe, because of the information Nell had stolen. Celeste called, her voice carrying tightly restrained irritation. "The information you took didn't help me at all. The entire schedule changed after the traitor was found. I need you to get more." Nell said yes, like always. But that week, something else began to happen. Cade started appearing near her more often. Not by accident. She served at the lounge, and he stopped by to inspect it. She cleared tables at the penthouse, and he passed through, paused, asked what she thought of the music playing. She was in the kitchen late at night making tea, and he walked in, took a glass of water, stood beside her for 3 minutes without saying a word, then left. 3 minutes of silence that Nell didn't find uncomfortable, and that frightened her more than any conversation could have. Then one evening, she opened the refrigerator in her room and stopped. That morning, it had held 1 carton of milk close to expiring and half a loaf of bread. Now it held fresh fruit, cheese, a container of chicken soup still warm, and a bottle of juice she had once mentioned in passing to Oren that she used to love as a child. There was no note, no explanation. Nell went looking for Oren. "Who put food in the refrigerator in my room?" she asked. Oren looked at her with the flattest face in recorded human history. "I don't know anything," he said. His face said he knew exactly everything. His eyes said he would take that secret to the grave. And the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth, so slight it almost didn't exist, said that after 15 years working for Cade Mercer, this was the first time he had ever seen his boss put food aside for anyone. Nell went back to her room, shut the door, sat in front of the open refrigerator, looked at the container of chicken soup still warm, and cried. Not much. Just enough to understand that she was betraying the man who had quietly put chicken soup in her refrigerator, and that she was the worst thief in New York. Not because she stole badly, but because she was stealing from the only person who had ever given her something without asking for anything in return. Nell shouldn't have been on the penthouse rooftop at 11 o'clock at night, wearing Celeste Marchetti's dress, standing 2 steps away from Cade Mercer, with the Manhattan wind blowing her hair across her face. But Nell didn't know how to say no, and when Oren told her Cade wanted her on the rooftop to give her opinion about the bar setup for the upcoming event, she had said yes, as always, even though she knew it was an excuse so thin the wind could have carried it away. The dress was the first problem. Celeste had sent it that morning with a message. You need to look the part if you're going to appear beside him. Wear this. The dress was black, long, backless, and very clearly designed for Celeste's body. A body at least 1 size slimmer than Nell's. Nell had put it on and immediately understood the problem. It was tight across her chest, tight at her waist, and the zipper in the back had been pulled as far as it could go and still felt stretched to the point where every breath she took seemed to be a negotiation with the seams. She had almost turned back to change, but Oren had knocked on the door, and Nell had said yes, and now she was standing on the rooftop, breathing shallowly, trying not to think about the fact that she was short on both oxygen and common sense. Cade stood by the railing, looking out over the city. At some point he had taken off his jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the Manhattan lights fell across his face in a way that softened the hard lines there, in a way Nell shouldn't have noticed, but had noticed far more closely than she was allowed to. What do you think about the placement of the bar? He asked, turning to look at her. Nell opened her mouth to answer, and realized she didn't have enough air. She inhaled, the dress crushing her chest, and her answer came out as a broken breath. I think, she began. Inhaled again. The bar should go. Another breath, her face starting to turn red, not from embarrassment, but from actual lack of oxygen. Near the window. Inhale. On the... Inhale. West side. Cade frowned. Then his eyes moved from her face down to her chest, where the fabric was stretched so tightly the seams were crying for mercy, and he understood. You can't breathe, he said. Not a question. I can breathe, Nell said, and immediately had to gasp in a way that proved the opposite. Cade stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell him, that familiar scent she had carried with her ever since the bathtub night, and couldn't forget even if she wanted to. May I? He asked. His voice was quiet. His eyes stayed on hers, not lower, and Nell understood that he was asking permission to touch her. He was asking, not commanding. The most feared mafia boss in New York was asking the indebted bartender whether he had permission to help her breathe. Yes, Nell said, and the word left her mouth more easily than anything had all night. Cade moved behind her. Nell felt his warmth before she felt his hands. Near, so near, but not touching yet. Then his fingers found the zipper. He pulled it down slowly, carefully, millimeter by millimeter, and Nell felt the fabric loosen, felt her chest open, felt air rush back into her lungs. But she stopped breathing, not because the dress was too tight, because his hand was warm against her bare back, because his fingers were close to her spine, because his breath brushed lightly against the back of her neck, and she could feel every knuckle through the thin layer of skin, with no fabric between them, and her entire body was responding in a way she couldn't blame on alcohol, because she was completely sober. Better? He asked, still standing behind her, his voice lower than usual. Nell said. And that wasn't really a word, but it carried far more information than she had meant to give. Cade stepped back around in front of her, and now the distance between them didn't exist. He was nearly 8 inches taller than she was, which meant she had to tilt her head up, and he had to bend down. And when he bent down, his mouth stopped 1 inch from hers. 1 inch. Nell could have counted every eyelash he had at this distance. He didn't kiss her. He stopped, waited, gave her the choice. And Nell understood, with an instinct deeper than reason, that this man who could take anything he wanted through strength or power or fear, was standing here 1 inch from her mouth, waiting for her to decide. For the first time in her life, Nell chose. Not saying yes because someone needed something. Not agreeing because there was no other choice. She chose because she wanted to. She kissed him first. She rose on her toes, caught hold of his shoulder, and pressed her mouth to his. And the world stopped. Or perhaps only Nell stopped. His mouth was warm and firm, and he kissed her back, as if he had been waiting for this for a very long time, but would never have crossed that 1 inch on his own. His hand came up to her face, that large hand cradling her cheek completely, and Nell felt all of herself turn hot from the inside out. He pulled her closer, and she felt his chest against hers, felt his heart pounding beneath his shirt, and he kissed her deeper, and Nell made a small sound into his mouth that she would be embarrassed about later but didn't care about now. She didn't care about anything except the taste of whiskey on his lips, and his hand at her waist, and the way he lifted her more gently than anyone had ever touched her before. Cade lost control for 2 seconds, only 2 seconds. His hand tightened at her waist, pulling her flush against him, and from somewhere deep in his throat came a low sound that Nell felt more in her bones than in her ears. Then he stopped. Nell saw the moment he stopped. His eyes opened, dropped to his own hand where it held her waist, and she saw him look at the scar across his knuckle, only quickly. But long enough. He let her go. Gently. Stepped back. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "You don't need to apologize," Nell said. "I kissed you first." He looked at her. She looked at him, and between them was the 1 inch they had already crossed, and could never uncross. "I should go," Nell said, because if she stayed here 1 more minute she would kiss him again, and this time she wasn't sure either of them would stop. She turned and walked away quickly, not running because running would have meant admitting she was fleeing, but her steps were faster than an ordinary walk. Celeste was waiting in her room, sitting on the bed, legs crossed, her face expressionless. "Well?" Celeste asked. "Does he care less about the engagement now?" Nell stood in the doorway, her lips still warm, her heart still beating in the wrong rhythm, and she knew the correct answer was yes, the plan is working, but the true answer was something else entirely. "Did he kiss you?" Celeste asked, her eyes narrowing. "I kissed him," Nell said. Celeste looked at her with the expression of someone who had hired an assassin only to have the assassin come back and say, "I fell in love with the target." She looked as if she wanted to throw herself off the rooftop. 3 days after the kiss on the rooftop, Oren knocked on Nell's door at 7 in the morning and said 4 words. "We found Brody." Nell couldn't remember whether she had put on shoes before running after Oren down to the basement. She couldn't remember what she had asked on the way there, though she was certain she had asked something, because her throat was raw and dry by the time they arrived. Oren paused at the heavy steel door, his hand hovering over the keycard reader. "We found him in a low-rent motel on the outskirts of Queens," he muttered without looking at her. He hadn't left the room in 3 weeks, living off vending machine snacks and sheer terror. He knew if the Volkovs found him before we did, he wouldn't just be in debt, he'd be in the ground. Then the door clicked open, and there he was, her brother, 32 years old, but looking 45, so thin that his collarbones pushed out beneath his loose t-shirt, gray skin, hollow eyes, and hands that shook without stopping. The kind of trembling Nell recognized at once because she had seen her father shake like that before he died, the kind of trembling that belonged to someone who had driven his body past its limits too many times. Brody looked at her, and Nell looked back, and for one short, brutal moment, she saw everything at once. She saw the 17-year-old boy carrying her out of a burning house. She saw the brother who taught her how to tie her shoes in the first foster home because no one else had cared enough to teach her. She saw the man calling at 3 in the morning asking for money, his voice shaking, his promises empty. She saw the child and the destroyer of that child living inside the same body, and she loved them both, and she hated them both, and she was tired all the way down to her bones. "Nell," Brody said, and his voice broke on the last sound of her name. Then he did the thing Nell had known he would do, the thing she had feared he would do, the thing she had prayed he wouldn't do but knew he would because he always did. "Do you have any money?" Brody asked. "Just 500. I swear this time I'll pay you back. I swear, Nell. I just need one chance to win it back." Nell broke. Not the kind of breaking that cried or screamed, the quiet kind. The kind where something inside her, the thing that had held her in place every time Brody called, every time she opened her wallet, every time she said yes because he was the only family she had, that thing snapped, and from the broken pieces of it, something else rose. "No," Nell said. The word left her mouth, and it wasn't easy. It was heavy, heavier than any word she had ever spoken, but it came out, and it stood. "No, Brody, you don't get to borrow anymore. Not from me, Not from anyone. You go to rehab, or you lose me. Brody blinked. Then his face changed, from desperation to anger so fast Nell almost stepped back. Almost. She didn't step back. Lose you? Brody said, his voice rising. What are you talking about? I'm the only family you've got. I carried you out of that fire. Did you forget that? Did you forget who kept you alive when you were 14 and had no one left in this world? Every word cut into Nell like a blade. Because Brody was right. He had carried her out of the fire. He had kept her alive. And he had used that as a weapon every time she tried to say no. Every time. For 13 years. You're ungrateful, Brody said, taking a step toward her. After everything I've done for you, you won't give me $500? No, Nell said again. Her voice was shaking. Her eyes were wet. But her feet didn't move. This was the first time in her life Nell had said no to Brody. The first time she stood in front of her brother, the man taller than she was by a head, the man who had saved her, the man who had ruined her, and she did not give in. You go to rehab, she said, her voice trembling but steady. Or you lose me. That's the only choice you have. Brody looked at her as if she had slapped him. Then he turned away and punched the wall, and Oren stepped in and took him out before things could get worse. Nell stood alone in the room. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking, but she had said no, and she was still standing. 2 hours later, Oren told her in the most ordinary voice he could manage that Brody had been taken to a rehabilitation center in upstate New York, the best facility in the Northeast, a cost Nell didn't even want to think about. Who paid for it? Nell asked, though she already knew the answer. Oren gave her that familiar expression that said, I know nothing. Nell went looking for Cade. He was in the study reading documents, and she tried not to look at the paper crane still sitting on the desk beside his laptop, because every time she looked at it, she wanted to laugh and cry at once. You sent Brody to rehab, she said. Not a question. Cade didn't look up. Oren handled it. Oren doesn't make that kind of decision on his own. Silence. Cade turned a page. Why? Nell asked, and her voice came out softer than she wanted it to. You didn't owe me that. You didn't owe Brody anything. Why did you do it? Cade was silent so long that Nell thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Then he said, his eyes still on the papers, his voice as unyielding as a frozen lake, not a ripple in it. I know what it is to lose family because no one stepped in soon enough. A pause. I don't want you to lose your brother the same way. 2 sentences, 19 words, his voice flat, his face unchanged, his hand still resting on the page, but Nell heard it. Beneath that flat voice, beneath the layers of control and stone and steel he had wrapped around himself for 13 years, there was a crack. Small, fine as a strand of hair. But it was there. He had just shown her something he showed no one. His mother. She didn't know the details yet, but she knew enough. He had lost his mother, and no one had stepped in soon enough. And he had carried that with him for 13 years, and he had just let her see into that wound, not because he wanted to, but because she had asked, and he didn't know how to lie to her. Nell stepped over to him. Cade still looked at the papers. She placed her hand on his shoulder. Lightly, the way he had placed his hand on her shoulder that night in the bathroom. Only 2 seconds. Only to steady her. Cade didn't say anything, didn't look up, but he leaned, very slightly, so slightly it was almost impossible to notice, into her hand. 1 second. Then Nell pulled her hand away, and they both pretended it hadn't happened. But it had, and they both knew it. The news about the warehouse came at 6 a.m. Nell was making tea in the penthouse kitchen when Oren passed by faster than usual, his phone pressed to his ear, his features set into an unreadable mask. She caught fragments. Volkov, burned out, 2 men injured. 10 minutes later, the penthouse had become a command center. People moved in and out without pause. Phones rang without stopping, and Cade stood in the middle of it all like a rock in moving water. He took reports, gave orders, made decisions, his voice flat and cold and exact, not a flicker in it. The Volkov family had burned the East Side warehouse. Millions of dollars in goods turned to ash. 2 guards badly burned. Nell stood in the corner of the kitchen, unnoticed by anyone, and watched. She watched Cade order Oren to deploy security teams to the remaining warehouses. She watched him call someone in a voice she had never heard before. The voice of a man who could destroy a family with 1 phone call and was deciding whether he should. She watched everyone in the room lower their heads, nod, obey. And she saw the thing no one else saw. Cade's hand gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Not from anger, but because 2 warehouse guards, 2 men from his organization, were lying in a hospital, and Cade Mercer, the man all of New York believed had no feelings, was gripping the table until his knuckles went white because 2 people under his protection had been hurt on his watch. Nell looked at those white knuckles and remembered his hand gentle against her back on the rooftop that night, remembered him loosening the zipper so she could breathe, remembered his hand on her shoulder for 2 seconds in the bathroom. The same hand. The hand that could destroy and the hand that loosened a zipper for a girl who couldn't breathe. The same man. Celeste called at 10 that night. Kade is distracted because of Volkov. This is the best time. His study will have the retaliation documents, deployment plans, alliance lists. I need everything. Nell sat on her bed, staring at the wall. Tonight? Tonight. And Nell said yes, like always. The study was dark, familiar. This was the second time she had slipped inside, and it wasn't any easier than the first. Her hands still shook. She still hated herself. The paper crane was still on the desk beside the laptop, and Nell didn't look at it because if she did, she wouldn't be able to do this. There was a thicker stack of documents on the desk than last time. She opened it and started taking pictures. First page, the plan to strike back at Volkov. Second page, the list of new warehouse locations. Third page, and she turned it and stopped. It wasn't a strategy document. It was a photograph, tucked between the pages as if someone had hidden it there because he didn't know where else to keep it, or because this was the only place private enough. An old black and white photograph, one corner slightly bent, a young man sitting on a sidewalk, his back against a brick wall. Cade, younger, thinner, his face not yet marked by the hard lines Nell knew so well, but she recognized him at once, because of the eyes. Cade in the photograph was about 23 years old. His white t-shirt was covered in blood, not a little, blood across his chest, his arms, his face. But he didn't look hurt, he looked empty. His eyes were open, staring straight at the camera, and there was nothing inside them. No anger, no grief, no fear, empty. The kind of empty a person had after losing something there were no words for. Nell knew that kind of empty. She had worn it on her own face at 14, standing on the sidewalk watching her parents' house burn, orange fire reflected in her eyes, while someone wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and she felt nothing, because she felt nothing at all. Not for weeks afterward. She looked at 23-year-old Cade in that photograph and saw 14-year-old Nell standing in front of the burning house. The same eyes, the same emptiness, the same thing taken away and never returned. His mother. He had said 2 sentences the afternoon before, his voice flat, his eyes not looking at her. I know what it is to lose family because no one stepped in soon enough. And now she was looking at this photograph, and those 2 sentences had shape, had blood, had the empty eyes of a 23-year-old man sitting on a sidewalk with his mother's blood on his shirt. Tears fell before Nell realized she was crying. They landed on the photograph, and she wiped them away fast, afraid of damaging it, then placed the picture back in exactly the same position, between page 3 and page 4, at the same angle, because he would know if someone had touched it, because this was the most private thing she had ever seen of his, and she had invaded it, the way she invaded his study, the way she invaded his trust every day. Nell left the study, closed the door, leaned back against the wall of the dark hallway and cried for another 30 seconds, silently, one hand over her mouth. Then she took out her phone and called Celeste. Well? Celeste asked. I don't have anything, Nell said. Her voice was flat, and she was surprised by how flat it sounded. What did you say? Celeste's voice sharpened. The documents on the desk didn't have anything useful. Old schedules, numbers we already knew, no retaliation plans. She lied. Nell Ashford, who didn't know how to say no, who said yes to everyone, had just lied. And she lied well enough to frighten herself. Celeste was silent on the other end. A long silence. The kind of silence Nell could feel the weight of, like something being measured. Are you sure? Celeste asked at last. I'm sure. 2 more seconds of silence. Fine, Celeste said, and hung up. Nell sat on her bed, staring at the dark screen of her phone, and understood that she had just done something she had never done before. She had hidden information from Celeste. She had lied to the woman who held her freedom in her hands. She had chosen Cade, not because he asked, Not because anyone forced her. She chose him because of the photograph of a 23-year-old man sitting on a sidewalk with blood on his shirt. Because of those empty eyes that looked like her own. Because she couldn't betray someone who had once been a child who lost his mother the way she had once been a child who lost everything. And in Celeste's silence before she hung up, Nell had heard suspicion. Small, but there, and she knew that silence wouldn't stay silent for long. Oren set the phone down on the desk, the screen facing Cade, and said nothing. He didn't need to. On the screen were call logs, messages, data the security team had pulled from the internal surveillance system. Nell Ashford. 17 calls to Celeste Marchetti's number over the past 2 weeks. 3 after-hours entries into the study. Photographs of documents in her phone's memory. Sent out, deleted, but not deleted thoroughly because she was a bartender, not a spy, and she didn't know that deleting images from a gallery didn't mean deleting them from the cloud. Cade looked at the screen. Silent. Oren stood across from him and waited. 15 years working together had taught him when to speak and when to remain still. This was a moment for stillness. Cade looked at the data and felt no surprise. That was the first thing he noticed, the absence of surprise. He wasn't shocked. Some part of him, the part that ran calculations and assessed risk and read people the way other men read balance sheets, had known. Not known exactly, but known enough. The scent of Nell on his robe on the night of the bath. The same vanilla trace the security team had reported near the areas Celeste used. The way Celeste looked at Nell at the party. Not the way one looked at a server, but the way one looked at a chess piece. The way Nell sometimes looked at him with a guilt he had never been able to explain. The look of someone holding a knife behind her back and not wanting to use it. He had known. He just hadn't wanted to know. Cade closed the phone screen, set it down on the desk, leaned back in his chair, and thought. Not about betrayal. He was used to betrayal. Betrayal was the second language of the world he lived in, and he spoke it as fluently as he read a contract. He thought about the bathtub. She had been lying in the water, drunk, eyes closed, and when she opened them and saw him, she laughed. Not the laugh of fear, not the laugh of calculation. She laughed because she found him funny. He thought about the way she had buried her face in his robe and asked what cologne he wore, as seriously as if she were asking for state secrets. He thought about the smile she had given him while mixing the old-fashioned, the smile of someone standing in the one place where she belonged. He thought about her hand on his shoulder yesterday afternoon, light, only a second, after he had spoken about his mother when he had never meant to say it aloud. He thought about the kiss on the rooftop, the way she had risen on her toes, gripped his shoulder, and kissed him first. Not because anyone had told her to, because she wanted to. And he thought about the thing 20 years in the underworld had taught him to read better than almost anyone, the scent of lies. Everyone had a scent when they lied. Faint, almost impossible for most people to notice. But Cade noticed it. Sweat changed. Breathing changed. Something in the chemistry of the body betrayed falsehood even when the mouth tried to cover it. And Nell, every time she stood near him, every time she looked at him, every time she touched him, never smelled false. She was betraying him to Celeste, yes, but she also loved him. And both things were true, and Cade didn't know what to do with that information, because his whole life had been built on one simple principle. Betrayal was dealt with, no exceptions. Sir, Oren broke the silence, his voice careful. How do you want me to handle this? Handle. In their world, that word carried a very specific weight. Handle meant Nell disappeared. Not necessarily in the worst sense, but disappeared from the penthouse, from his life, from the board. Quick, clean, final, the way Cade ran everything. No, Cade said. Oren didn't blink, but his silence grew heavier by a ton. No? Don't handle it. Don't confront her. Don't do anything. She's leaking information to Celeste Marchetti, Oren said slowly, as if Cade might have missed that detail. I heard you. She's betraying you. I know. Then why aren't you handling it? Cade looked at Oren. Then he opened the desk drawer. The paper crane lay inside, white, small, fragile. Every fold still sharp, though it had been nearly 2 weeks. He looked at it. Because she folds paper cranes when she's kidnapped, Cade said. Shoved into a car in the middle of the night, brought into a mafia boss's interrogation room, and she sits there folding a paper crane out of a tissue. He paused. Because she wiped the coffee stain off the interrogation table before I walked in. Because she lay naked in my bathtub, drunk, and invited me to join her in the most serious voice I have ever heard. He closed the drawer, gently. Someone like that doesn't betray because she wants to, Oren. She betrays because she doesn't see another choice. Because someone offered her a bargain she didn't know how to refuse. Because she has never known how to refuse. And Celeste knows that. Silence. So what are you going to do? Oren asked. Cade looked out at the glass. Manhattan at night. A million lights. And somewhere in this penthouse, a bartender was sleeping in a small room, perhaps lying awake, staring at the ceiling, perhaps hating herself for lying to Celeste tonight, because he knew she had lied to Celeste. He had read the data. The photographs she took tonight were missing 3 pages from the documents on his desk, and she had held back the exact 3 pages that contained the retaliation plans against Volkov, the 3 most important pages, and sent Celeste the worthless stack instead. She was betraying Celeste for him, while betraying him for Celeste. And she didn't know he knew both things. I want to see whether she finds another choice, Cade said. I want to see what she chooses, who she chooses. Oren looked at him for a long moment. In 15 years, he had seen Cade order traitors dealt with without blinking, and now he was sitting here talking about a debtor bartender as if she were the final problem he wanted to solve with patience instead of violence. You love her, Oren said. Not a question. Cade didn't answer. He didn't need to. The paper crane in the drawer had answered that on the very first day. This time, Celeste didn't call. She came in person.